Thank you very much, Jeff, for the introduction. And thank you to Bobby Soto for setting this up. I very much appreciate it. Thank you all for being here. Yeah, when Jeff was talking about medical ethics in the news, that's why I've been able to be employed for a long time. Medical ethics has been very good to me in that way. So anyway, as you know, as some of you may know, I gave a talk before on end-of-life issues, death and dying. So far, it's not an area in which I've been an observer, but I haven't experienced it in any possible way. But tonight, I'm talking about something that I think I know even less about than death and the experience of dying. In fact, I actually, as I was putting this talk together, actually developed some sympathy for Bobby Kennedy, a little bit, in terms of his trying to keep track of it all, and so on. Is there an echo? Can you hear me? There is an echo?
No, it sounds good.
What?
It sounds good here.
Oh, it sounds good? Okay. All right, great. Okay, so I am talking about, I think, a very complicated issue tonight. I personally don't think the issue should be so complicated, but the discussion that's going on in our society clearly indicates that for a lot of people, this is a complicated issue. So I'm going to begin by talking about the public health powers of the state, the National Childhood Vaccination Injury Act of 1986. Has anyone heard of that? One person has. Arguments against mandatory vaccinations for children, a reciprocity justice argument I'm going to give at one point. I'm going to discuss exemptions and herd immunity. And then finally, I'm actually going to say a little bit about families, because we are talking about children. And so talking about children, we talk about families. So pediatrician counseling a new mother. Mother, should I vaccinate my daughter? And the pediatrician says, just vaccinate the kids you want to keep. That would be worth being a pediatrician for, to be able to say that. Okay, so first, as I said, I'm going to talk about public health, excuse me, and the use of force, the public health powers in relation to the use of force. Obviously, public health is concerned about stopping the spread of infectious disease, tools that are used or isolation and quarantine. At times, it may become necessary to bring in the assistance of law enforcement. But to be very clear, the connection between law enforcement and public health is not it's not a necessary connection. It's not something they're not automatically connected. There is a statutory authority and due process. There are state and local laws and due process rights when forced, isolated, or quarantined. In regards to public health and its use of force, there are limitations. And a number of guidelines, limitations, thinking about how to approach this have been worked out over time, and certain ideas have developed. One is the use of reasonable force, objectively reasonable force given the situation, and one wants to use less restrictive means when one can, and that would be more appropriate. So use less restrictive means is another idea. Focus on public safety, but when possible, protect individual rights to privacy and property. And a proportional response is the appropriate response. And public health authority and law enforcement, as I said, are not automatically connected. And the connection between them, it's a good idea to monitor as carefully as possible. And of course, all of us live through that with COVID. We all lived through it on a daily basis and saw the connections between these things. Scenarios that justify the use of force, well, one is forced isolation for individual for refusing to comply with orders and who pose risk. And there was actually one case in Kentucky where a man refused to comply with isolating himself. And so he actually was confined to his house. And the police staked his house out and he could not leave during the time that he was COVID positive. And also, we probably are all aware about the cruise ships that were not permitted to dock in US ports where COVID had broken out. American cruise ships weren't permitted to land in many Asian ports. And in one case, there's one ship that finally found a dock in Cambodia, but none of the Asian countries permitted that docking. So these are tools. These are used by different countries, and we use them as well. Limits on the freedom expressed in the 14th Amendment. Well, in 1777, Washington actually ordered the troops inoculated for smallpox. And I'm not sure that you know this, but there used to be a terrible epidemic every spring in the New England colony with smallpox, and that went on for a very long time. In fact, the first inoculation was used there. A man named Boylston, and if you know Boston, then you know the main drag is named Boylston Street. But it was Boylston, a doctor, who did the first inoculation there. In 1793, quarantine was ordered for Philadelphia because yellow fever had broken out, and 5,000 in a population of 55,000 had died, and that's when they ordered quarantine. 1796, Congress adopted, Washington signed the first federal quarantine law. There was one point early in our existence when we were quite serious about protecting the public health. 1799, second more restrictive laws that were signed by Adam, and it supported federal efforts to support state measures. And then in 1903, this case that went up to the Supreme Court, Jacobson versus Massachusetts.
See that fine. People can see you.
Oh.
Oh.
Yeah, you can see me. You know where I am, right? Jacobson versus Massachusetts. The law in Massachusetts permitted cities to vaccinate residents against smallpox. And Cambridge adopted this law. It did allow medical exemptions. Again, we're going to talk more about exemptions a little bit later. But Jacobson refused. And he was fined $5, which is the equivalent today of $180. Jacobson claimed that the law violated the 14th Amendment, his 14th Amendment right to liberty. The decision was that the law was a legitimate exercise of the state's police power to protect public health and safety of citizens. Requiring vaccines was reasonable and not arbitrarily imposed. So talk a little bit about the basic function of the state. And this actually goes back to Hobbes and Locke. If you're familiar with those philosophers, they were both dealing with this idea of coming up with legitimate authority of the state, given the fact that the idea of the divine right of the monarch was beginning to have much less of a hold on thought. And I think it was also the case that because of the discovery that was going on of the so-called New World, that both philosophers were inspired by this idea of a state of nature. If you're familiar with Hobbes, the state of nature for him was nasty, brutish, and short. The horrible, horrible place where even the strongest person could be killed in an instant. Locke had a different view of the state of nature. And this was, but anyway, the point is that that given the state of nature and our move from that state of nature to a state that we are in, the whole point of the state was to protect life. Once they were, the thing is, I keep hearing a little bit of an echo up here, and every once in a while it throws me off. I guess. What? It's okay. Oh, okay. 1, 2, 3. That's better. Thank you. Anyway, the basic function of the state over against the state of nature is to secure the lives of its citizens. Freedom is important. No question that freedom is important, particularly for Locke, but the protection of life comes first. And that is the most basic function of the state. And that is the source of the state's authority. Excuse me. So I mentioned, and I think one person knew of the National Vaccine Injury Compensation Program. And there's a bit of an irony here because we hear from people how much big pharma makes from developing vaccines. However, in the 1980s, actually, big pharma wanted to get out of the vaccine development business. There had been a liability scare connected with the DPT vaccine. And even though the claims that were out there, the side effects were not significant, there was still a great deal of concern. And big pharma thought there was just too much liability, not enough profit associated with developing vaccines. The federal government, because again, the job of the state is to make sure that we are protected and survive, went to big pharma and begged them to continue to produce the vaccines. They agreed, but they were concerned about that liability. So there was the establishment of the National Vaccine Compensation Program. The federal government, we would take on liability for any possible vaccine injury. So that was 1986. This act recognizes, everyone admits, no vaccine is 100% safe. Injuries do occur. People do have reactions, some very serious, and even death in some cases. It's the reason we recognize medical exemptions. Not everyone can be vaccinated because of a possible injury of some kind that could occur. Funded by an excise tax of 75 cents on every purchased dose of a covered vaccine. The standard that's used to determine if in fact an injury has occurred is preponderance of the evidence. And between 1986 and 2023, $4.6 billion has been paid out, $450,000 the average award. Now, it's kind of interesting because when I looked at the analysis of what actually occurred in these situations, these were negotiated settlements. And in many cases, it was just a negotiated settlement, and it wasn't even admitting necessarily fault. I don't know if you remember, but there's one particularly big case during COVID that a number of people opposed to the vaccines pointed to, where the government paid out. And what people didn't realize is that's what the government does in these cases. There was something, it wasn't the vaccine exactly, but there was some kind of injury that was associated in some way, and the government paid out, as they always do in these cases. But it is interesting that only one person has heard of this, and it's been in place for quite a while. Okay, what arguments are there against mandatory vaccines for children? Generally, there are two approaches that people take when they're opposed to mandatory vaccines. And one more thing I want to say, when I talk about mandatory vaccines, and I was actually online the other day looking around at Canada, other countries, people talk about mandatory vaccines, but I'm not sure that I saw any country where there's just a vaccination of the entire public. Even China actually may talk about mandatory vaccine, but what generally is meant by mandatory vaccine is that if you're going to go to a public school, then you have to have certain set of vaccines. But it's not as though the government comes in and vaccinates all children. We don't have that. And I'm not sure that I couldn't find any country that takes that approach. So it seems as though it's something that is mandatory in a particular place and time and context. You want to go to public school, you have to get these vaccines. So again, there are two approaches generally that are taken. One is to really question the safety, effectiveness, or relevance of the vaccines. And therefore, given those questions that they have about the vaccine, they would argue that parental choice should follow. Other proponents argue that doctors are abandoning the Hippocratic Oath in order to push a public health agenda and are becoming agents of the state. I actually think the second argument is more interesting. And I'll explain why. Okay, parental rights. As we all know, there are limits to decisions that parents can make for their children or things that parents can do in relation to their children. Parents cannot abuse or neglect their children. Those are the two definite limitations. So the question is, in relation to abuse or neglect, where does vaccine refusal fall? And again, people in opposition appraise vaccines. Different vaccines get a different appraisal. And then also there's an issue of just basic disagreement over facts. So there's issue of safety or whether the vaccines are optional. So now these are not my views. These are the arguments that I'm getting from people who are opposed. Non-threatening, like non-life threatening, chickenpox, mumps, and measles. So in their view, parental refusal is not neglect. HPV and hepatitis is related to sexual activity. This is an area where parents want to be able to educate their children in regards to the family's values. And therefore, people say this should also be, I should say opponents say this should also be an area of choice. Some, and I put Kennedy's name in, even question the polio vaccine. Either it has caused more deaths, and the idea is that there's a cancer that we're all susceptible to because of the polio vaccine that was used between particular years, or it disappeared without the vaccine due to improvements in sanitation. This is what Kennedy has said. And both those claims, as far as I can tell, are wrong. I've looked at the discussion of the cancer, and there's no validity there at all that somehow polio vaccine used in a certain period of time somehow has contributed to the development of cancer. And the sanitation improvements came late 19th century. Some of you may, like me, be old enough to remember polio. Our house was really clean. The streets were clean. Even the parks were clean, but I wasn't permitted to go to the park. I couldn't go to the amusement park, couldn't go to the public swimming pool. it was terrifying. And I also remember when all of a sudden my mother read in the newspaper that they had developed a vaccine. It was absolutely thrilling, incredible. Anyway, I do want to, I'm really not, okay, I will say this about Kennedy. He has never read, as far as I can tell, and I'm not a scientist, okay? He has never read a scientific paper correctly, ever. He quotes constantly from various scientific papers, and he's never correct. He was talking about a vaccine, and the doctors are trying to figure out if some particular additive to the vaccine left the children at a certain point, whether they could detect the additive leaving. Could they find it? And he was talking about this, and he said they never detected it. You know, so where did that additive go? Is the question he's asking. All you had to do is look in the first paragraph, the abstract of the article, and it says the additive was found in the children's stools 3 days after they were vaccinated. Right there in the abstract, it says that. I'm really trying to remain as objective as possible, but okay, effectiveness. Questions raised whether many vaccines are effective. Claims are made that other approaches are more effective. And you've heard these claims: vitamin A, good diet, exercise, and so on. Okay, there's a disagreement over facts. Now, this is the facts that I've been able to collect in regards to these different diseases. Mumps, swelling in the face, fever, sorry, there's a typo, headache, but possible meningitis, encephalitis, and pancreatitis. These are possible, these are possibly associated with mumps. Rubella, encephalitis, bleeding problems, and post-rubella, and neurological issues. Measles, pneumonia, encephalitis. Yeah, no, I'm just saying, Jeff, your thing is popping up here. It is a book I would recommend too. It's a very good book. Measles, pneumonia, encephalitis, ear infections, diarrhea, croup. I'll just say croup. Inflammation of airways, breathing issues, progressive brain disorder that can develop years later. Years later, it can develop if you've had measles. Blindness, deafness, seizures, hepatitis. So when parents refuse, do we call this neglect? And you can answer the question for yourself as I've answered the question. Relevance of HPV and hepatitis. Hepatitis and HPV are related to sexual activity. And if parents are raising their children with a certain set of values, why should they not be able to refuse the vaccine? I didn't realize until I was putting this talk together. Do you realize that hepatitis is now a vaccine that's given a newborn within 12 and 24 hours? I didn't realize that. Now, parents are asked permission and parents can refuse it, just so you know. It's not done automatically. But the thinking is that they were trying to keep track of mothers who might be positive for hepatitis, but it just happens too quickly. So they just decided that this is the best way to deal with it. As far as I can tell from the reading, it's a completely safe vaccine and it's very effective. HPV recommended for children 12 to 14 can be given as young as 9. More than 90% of cancers caused by cause HPV. I'm sorry. More than 90% of cancers not caused by it, but anyway, can be prevented by HPV. That's 29,000 a year of cancers. Relevance of HPV and hepatitis. This is the response to the parents who want to refuse those and say this is a matter of family values. Can parents predict or control the sexual behavior of their children? Can they? No. Speaking as both a parent and previously a child. I can vouch. An adolescent, I should say. Can parents predict or control the sexual behavior of their children's sexual partners? No. Their children's spouses? No. Opponents ask, why do different states differ in relation to what vaccines are required? Well, their answer, the science on which vaccines are based must not be objective. Therefore, it must not be about science, it must be about politics. The problem, however, is that their point can obviously be used against them. Science is sound and objective, but politics interferes along the same lines that we're talking about here. And this is the more interesting argument, I think. The Hippocratic Oath versus agents of the state. The claim is that past achievement of scientific medicine, including vaccinations, were developed within the scope of traditional individual-based Hippocratic ethics. So to be clear, what they're talking about here is the idea that you have a physician and you have a patient, and it's the physician's sole obligation to be concerned about their patient. That's what it means to talk about the Hippocratic framework. And what they're concerned about, as I'll talk a little bit more about in a second, is the physician's focus changing from being solely concerned about the best interest of their patient to a concern about the rest of us and the public health. The first claim I want to point out is actually, there's actually a problem here. They say the past achievement of scientific medicine, including vaccinations, were developed within the scope of traditional individual-based Hippocratic ethics. If you actually look at the history of human subject experimentation, it took us about 2,500 years to get to a point where we realized that the physician, patient, and the experimenter subject, even though we both call them doctors, are actually very, very different. And so, yes, early vaccines were developed within the context of what they think of as the Hippocratic tradition. But if you look at the history of human subject experimentation, in many cases that was done without informed consent, without full disclosure, with all kinds of exploitation of human subjects. It wasn't until post Tuskegee and Nuremberg and Helsinki report, the Belmont report, that we finally realized they're not the same thing. Okay, the focus was, anyway, back to this argument, the focus was on the physician's individual patient, and the concern was to do no harm. Then, therefore, the physician is obligated, in terms of the Hippocratic framework, to focus on the interests of the individual patient and not the good of society, whatever that involves. When the physician focuses on the good of society, however it is understood, they become an agent of the state. And I do think this is an interesting issue, as I said. It's a little more interesting, because I think we must admit this is no small concern. And one terrible example we have of this occurring is what happened to organized medicine in Nazi Germany, where the entire scientific and medical establishment was moved over to focus on the purification of the Aryan race. So we do have to be concerned about this. So it does seem that to be the case that the physicians have shifted their focus to public health and the general good. This concerns opponents. The question is whether they have shifted their focus or broadened their focus. Has the physician embraced the collective and abandoned the care of their individual patients? Has the physician shifted to a utilitarian perspective where they have ceased to be an advocate for their individual patients? Has something alarming occurred? And that is where the facts and what they are perceived to be become really important. And you saw in earlier slides, you saw my listing of facts that are associated with those diseases, and you saw a minimization of those possible effects listed by opponents of vaccines. So getting clear about the facts is fundamentally important. My own view is that diseases that are preventable through a regimen of vaccination are important to avoid. The complications of contracting such disease can be deadly serious and tragic. I also think that risks associated with vaccines are real, but there is great exaggeration and distortion in the way such risks are described. It's not either or. The choice then is not between being an advocate for one's patient, that is within the Hippocratic framework, or an agent of the state. One who advocates for their patient is also concerned with the public's health, and children engage in public life. And given the facts that I described, one is concerned about both. Of course, what might follow for a pediatrician concerned with public health is that they might have an obligation. There's a whole debate going on about this issue of whether pediatricians should take into their practice children who aren't vaccinated, children whose parents refuse to have them vaccinated. I think, and we could talk about this, and some of you may be physicians and have dealt with this. I think physicians are obligated to take into their practice even children whose parents refuse a vaccine. The reason being that if we're going to say on the one hand that doctors should be concerned about the public health, then they should also be concerned about making sure that those children get health care, and also keeping them in their practice is the best possible way of educating parents about the importance of getting those vaccines. I know that's really complicated and tricky because we're talking about children being in a waiting room who aren't vaccinated, and that gets yeah, and how you deal with that is a challenge. I know there's a practice up north that advertises we don't take unvaccinated children, and then there's another practice up north someplace that advertises we do take unvaccinated children. So there's a lot of interesting, different things going on here. Okay. Arguments from the other side. Parents have a duty to do what is in the best interest of their child. Problem, there's disagreement over what their child's best interest is, vaccinated or not. And it seems to me clear the state has an interest in getting everybody vaccinated. Generally, it is a child's best interest to be vaccinated. I think we can say that that's pretty clear. However, vaccination can be risky, causing injury or death. Therefore, it appears, there's a little bit of a game theory going on here. Therefore, it appears that the best interest of a child is to have all the other children vaccinated, which would create herd immunity for the first child. This means that, of course, that the child number one becomes a free rider, facing none of the risk, but experience the benefit of all the other kids being contributing to herd immunity. Is this fair? Claim, parents have a duty to others to get their child vaccinated. Does this follow? I'm not sure it does. And I'm still thinking about it, but I'm not sure that it does. I have a duty to my child. Why do I have a duty to your child? I'm not sure it follows. The better argument, I think, is this justice or a kind of reciprocity argument. Given the risk that you subjected your child to that provides a benefit for my child, it is only fair that I do something in return, which is to get my child vaccinated, thus contributing to the creation of herd immunity that benefits us all. So I'm still thinking about this, but I think the second argument makes a little more sense. The first one, I think, is problematic. So now on to exemptions and what to do about them. We have medical exemptions, religious exemptions, and philosophical exemptions. Medical, the physician would be involved in evaluating whether the child needs a medical exemption. Religious parents would seek this exemption. The religious view, for some reason, prohibits vaccinations. Christian scientists might take this view. Others might as well. And then philosophical. We'll talk a little more, though. So first, religious exemptions. There's no issue with medical exemptions, right? Religious exemptions. 4. Here's the argument 4. The importance of religious freedom, particularly in this country. Impact on parental rights, trying to raise their children according to a certain set of values. And then the other is, it's not clear how many religious exemptions we actually have to give. And so it may not really contribute meaningfully to a decrease in herd immunity against religious exemptions. Religious exemptions lower herd immunity if there's a sizable number of them. Also, religious exemptions can be exploited. People make up all kinds of things. Often involves representation of the faith traditions. In fact, most faith traditions support vaccination. And so that's an interesting point. But this was a particular issue here because of the First Amendment. And if you remember, there are a number of people very angry that at such a time when people needed so much to be able to attend church, synagogue or whatever, those places of worship were closed down. They were locked down. So it's clear that religion is fundamentally important. And so, but on the other hand, religious exemptions create a number of problems. And it's not clear even that they're required given a variety of religions that we might look at. California eliminated entirely religious and personal exemptions in 2015. This was after, if you recall, there were big measles outbreaks in California, both in Marin County and also, I think, Disneyland. Led to an increase in medical exemptions, doctors, nurses, practitioners selling exemptions. So what was going on is they eliminated religious exemptions, but there are doctors selling medical exemptions and nurse practitioners doing this. West Virginia, for years, and this always surprised me that West Virginia, a state I associated with religious belief, primarily because when I was driving through West Virginia on a number of occasions, the only stations I could get were religious stations. I don't know if you've driven through West Virginia, but for years, only medical exemptions. But just recently, with an executive order, the governor reversed that and has now included religious and philosophical exemptions. I talked to a friend of mine who teaches at the medical school of West Virginia, and I asked how they got this through. And he just said that, it was a time, not the recent development, but how they only had medical exemptions. And he said, well, we just persuaded the legislators that this made good sense in relation to the various diseases that we were trying to avoid. Philosophical exemptions. 4, parental autonomy. Parents simply have a right to make decisions regarding their children's health. And also there's a significant distrust of both government and pharmaceutical corporations that relate to these philosophical exemptions. Against, There's a serious risk to public health, decreased herd immunity, increased danger for those legitimately medically exempt, and infants. Implications for those of us who are vaccinated when herd immunity decreases. As we all know, no vaccine is 100% effective, and vaccinated people exposed to a strong dose of the virus may get sick. Also, immunity wanes, as we all know. And again, if the virus is circulating in the community, a vaccinated person can contract the illness. And then, of course, as herd immunity decreases, variants of the virus can more easily circulate And there was a recent Emory study that just came out in July, just came out last week, I think. 33% of parents are planning to refuse some or all childhood vaccinations. They report concern with side effects, distrust of scientific and medical community, distrust of big pharma, perception that diseases in question are not that severe, and political and religious concerns. So the future does not look good at all. I want to talk about families. Talking about children, children are in families. I'm a proponent of families. I think families are extremely valuable. Why do we value families? We give a lot of freedom to parents. As long as parents don't harm or neglect children, we allow parents to make a lot of decisions for their children. They can decide where children will live, how they'll be educated, whether they'll have siblings. What constitutes harm or neglect is complicated, and we have to examine our own values and prejudices regularly as we make these judgments. It is complicated when we talk about family and family values. My point is that families have moral value. That's the kind of value that families have. It appears to be the case that families are the only institution where human beings ideally are valued simply because they are, because they exist. They have intrinsic value, unconditional value. And I think the church, just to talk about the church, the Catholic Church for a second, and other religions capture this as well, recognize that the marriage union, where two people commit to each other unconditionally, is the perfect circumstance in which to have kids, because parents are making an unconditional, hopefully, ideally, commitment to their children. In contrast, every other institution in society grades individuals, puts a certain relative value on them, figures out how to use them, determines a purpose and a place for them. It's only within the family, hopefully, ideally, that we are valued simply because we exist and not for any other purpose. Has anyone read Robert Frost's Death of the Hired Man? You might revisit that if you haven't read it recently. But it's about someone coming home and unconditionally they accept him, his return. It's a beautiful poem. Families also have political value. First, in terms of the political landscape, it does seem important that at least one of our institutions puts intrinsic value on human beings. Second, granting a certain measure of autonomy and authority to families contributes to a decentralization of political power, which I think is often a good idea. So thinking back to the beginning and question of what kind of public health power should be exercised by the state over individuals and families does require careful thought and wise judgment. Education, school mandates, and dialogue are called for, But then, you know, the question is, and again, what I'm talking about is the mandates we've put in place. If you want to attend public school, you need to get vaccinated. Are they adequate? Or is it just a realistic or a necessary compromise? And as I said, I spent time looking at different countries, and everyone is struggling with this. And it seems to be when kids go to school that's the point at which that arrangement is accepted. But a number of places in the US particularly, we have more and more private schools where kids don't necessarily have to get vaccinated. That's it. Thank you.
Before we start with questions, first of all, for your information, we're going to be alternating between questions from the live audience. Well, actually, the people on the webinar are also live. We haven't been invaded by zombies or robots yet. So Joan Linsenmeyer is going to help you with this. Let's start with a few questions from the room, and then I will bring some questions from the chat.
Okay, so have we any questions from the room?
I'm hoping this is a friendly question from an old friend. We'll see.
Mark, just a comment. I mean, you were talking about the kids and expectations about their, various activity and behavior. Not all of our kids are as pure as yours have been. Really.
And both of them are here, by the way.
I know. Mark, in your structure, it seemed to me that there were two parts to it. It's the state or the public government, and then you have the individual, the family unit or the individual. We have encountered situations where we're concerned about someone, for example, refusing vaccination, but then becoming a carrier for something that then endangers our own family, other families. And that seems to me that is something that the government should control. In other words, I think in your structure, you didn't, to me, I didn't hear too much conversation about the protection against somebody becoming just a carrier for COVID or something else. Sorry.
Thanks, Tom. I think I tried to I set out at the beginning the rules or the conventions that are used in regards to public health. And and I think public health officers, I think, again, it's a very complicated issue. It seems as though there are times when they do, as I mentioned, the person in Kentucky who went to his house, he was surrounded, and he was confined there till he finally tested negative. And we do have quarantines, we have other kinds of things, but the states, as we saw during COVID, respond differently to these situations. And there were some states, some governors of states who denied the facts that one could see in relation to COVID. So I guess the first question would be, how do we deal with this? How do we deal with it? We all saw during COVID the way in which, and I don't want this to sound like I'm just focused on one administration or another, but we kept seeing a very mixed message come from Trump during that time. There was a whole big discussion of ivermectin and other alternative ways of treating this. And there seemed to be great toleration between different states in regards to the way there was a response to this. So that would be, when you say structure, the structure is there in public health. The question is, I guess, is how that is actually administered, how those different conventions are applied. I thought that here in the state of Illinois, where I was very happy to be during this period, that Pritzker did a very good job. And that, but I guess what I'm trying to say is both in relation to kids being vaccinated and the mandates that they have to be vaccinated if they're going to attend public school, that is a kind of compromise. That's a point where the state can get kids vaccinated. But it's a kind of compromise. It's an agreement that's reached. And the same thing goes on a different level in regards to controlling behavior. So, I mean, and if I were in charge, I really would want everybody to be vaccinated. There's also a question, get everyone vaccinated. I think we remember there were also people forging COVID vaccination cards. Yeah, I mean, there's just so much that can be done to actually. Yeah, please.
Oh, sorry. Um, we know people who would say, it's my right as a parent to decide whether my child has this or that. Well, when you exercise that right, you're also exercising the privilege of possibly endangering others
yeah,
too.
yeah.
So that's what it is.
Yeah, well, I tried to respond to that. I think that when I listed all the different side effects, the different effects of acquiring those different illnesses, I thought I made the point that does constitute neglect, not to get your child vaccinated. What?
So we're going to take a question now from the webinar audience. The first question is from Drew regarding arguments against mandatory vaccination. How should we categorize resistance to mandates on religious grounds? That is, that someone's sincerely held religious beliefs inform their opposition to vaccination for their child. This isn't necessarily related to safety or effectiveness, and I'm not sure that it has to do with doctors abandoning the Hippocratic Oath. Some states, for example, Texas, allow parents and guardians to claim religious reasons or, quote, reasons of conscience, unquote, as grounds for exemption.
I have a paper on Jehovah's Witnesses, actually, and the whole issue of whether Jehovah's Witness parents should be able to refuse to vaccinate their kids. And I looked at the literature that exists as well as the court decisions. And I find them very problematic because the literature, the ethics literature and the court decisions argue that when a parent refuses a blood transfusion for their child, where the result is going to be death, that parent is harming their child. The problem with that is that the witnesses have a different view of reality than others do. And their view is that if you accept a blood transfusion, that constitutes a harm, and you will be cut off from the opportunity to be in God's New Jerusalem after you die. And I think we really can't respond to that argument in any particular effective way. You know, we like to think that the liberal state just calls strikes and balls. But in fact, if the liberal state takes the view that the witnesses are wrong and that the refusal of a blood transfusion does constitute a harm, then they're basically saying that the religion of the witnesses is totally without merit. And they can't do that. The reason is because the witnesses are making a metaphysical claim. And there's no basis in which we can argue that this metaphysical claim is incorrect, because we don't know what happens when we die. It could be that if you accept a blood transfusion, you're cut off from obtaining rebirth in God's New Jerusalem. I think the same could be said for other religious beliefs as well. As soon as we talk about religion, then we move into another area where it's not clear on what basis we would criticize those religious beliefs. In fact, I don't think we can. I guess the issue is what I conclude with the witnesses is that the state can't weigh in relation to whether the witnesses are wrong or right. What the state can do, and I'm not sure this argument works that well, but this is the only argument that works, I think. The state's job is to make sure that kids grow up to be adults, and then they can make decisions on their own. And I think the same could be said about certain religious beliefs that get in the way, that leads to parents refusing vaccines for their kids, particularly when we look at the facts. I would argue that they shouldn't have such a refusal. And I actually question whether we should have any religious exemptions at all. Now, it could be that we allow them if in fact it does not look like your children are being endangered by unvaccinated kids. But as soon as we see that there's that possibility, then I think we should require vaccinations. I don't think we should allow religious vaccinations. I recognize how complicated that is, and even if we could even pull that off, and that's why we keep falling back to some kind of compromise, hoping that we can get change through education.
So my question is, well, when the medical exemption is recognized pretty much by everybody, so that means that vaccine is indeed dangerous for certain children or certain people. And when the vaccine, but children get a lot of that standard, vaccination before going to school. And some, like right after they're born, no one knows that if this child or infant has, if it was mandatory, like, medical exemption type of health condition. So it takes a while to find out, right? And I am curious if in those very early age vaccination, there are more injuries or not.
That's a really good question, and I don't know the answer. I did check on the hepatitis vaccine that's given in the first 12 to 24 hours, and I didn't see, all I read is that it's extremely safe, and I didn't see a report of injuries. Now, whether that's true or not, I can't say, but I think that's a really interesting question. I do know this, talking to pediatricians and reading the literature, and if there's a pediatrician here who can help, that'd be great. Sometimes people say, I think that, well, first of all, vaccinations otherwise start later. And as far as I know, that's the point at which it becomes clear which children might be injured or not, I think. But the other thing is that the schedules are worked out. Sometimes people say, well, I'm just not comfortable with the schedules because it seems like being vaccinated too much at a time. In fact, the schedules are worked out both in relation to safety and in relation to effectiveness. So people should stick to schedules. But your question is really good, and I'm not giving you, I don't have an adequate answer for you. It's a good question.
Is developed after they are born, like that.
Yeah, I think one answer would be that's what we do, and there are, as we know, there are kids that are going to be injured, but overall, the vaccines that are developed are extremely safe and are effective and benefit kids.
Yeah,
It-
thank
it's
you.
not-
I mean,
it's not gonna-
I'm absolutely for a vaccine and
Yeah,
all
no, I
my
know
kids
that.
got
No.
everything. I just,
Yeah,
but
I can
question
sense
of
it. Right.
logic, yeah.
Yeah. But
And
you're
I
ask-
have thank you very much. Just one comment that, well, safety or public health is not only about vaccine. And I wanted to comment that when my children started going to school 15 years ago, I was just appalled that there is no organized like hand washing in kindergarten.
Yeah, I have to say, when that's a good, really good comment. Do you remember the government said you should wash your hands for 20 seconds, I think it was? I remember, she's not here tonight, but my youngest granddaughter was so, to use the term, so religious about this that it was so inspiring. She would count to herself and wash her. That's right, she would sing a song. Yeah. That's why she was 4 years old, I guess, right when she started this. I thought this was amazing that she was doing this. Yeah.
But they went to kindergarten, everything went out.
I'll bet other countries do better at this than we do. That could.
Let's
very well-
take another question from the webinar audience. This is from Kathy. And I think you've already, the discussion here has touched on this question already, but let you be the judge of that. If the job of the state is to protect the lives of citizens, this does not take into account the citizens' souls, psychological well-being, morals, social well-being, etc. It seems that, just as with the Hippocratic Oath issue, there is a real conflict between the societal and individual perspective. How does one come up with a rationale that satisfies both?
I have no clue. I don't know. That's what this is attempting to do. No, it's a really, really good question. I will say that Hobbes was, I don't think Hobbes, as I recall, was not really worried about the spiritual life. So, and I don't mean, and I'm not in any way making fun of that question, but I was just thinking back to Hobbes and Locke. Locke was concerned primarily with property, less about spiritual growth, and Hobbes was concerned about just survival. But you're absolutely right. We are concerned about that, and at least our founders wrote the First Amendment, which recognizes the importance of religious freedom. How you balance it, I would argue, and I think maybe I didn't. One of the things that the talk may not be a sort of a feeling around talk rather than just laying it out. But I think that to the greatest extent possible, we should make room for the values that are described in the question, that were listed in the question. But I think bottom line is ultimately is just safety and protection of lives. And again, I go back, I do think that is the most basic function of the state. And it seems to be every person of every political philosophy agrees with that, whether they're libertarians, liberals, socialists, communists, that the state is about making sure that we survive, most fundamentally.
This is maybe just a simple-minded question, but I'm going to ask.
The questions are
anyway.
really good. No, they're great. Very hard.
You had the list of, all the different vaccinations that kids can get, measles, mumps, rubella, HPV. But here's my question. I would think that the average bear doesn't really think that measles can lead to all of these other they just think measles. They're going to get over measles. They're going to get over mumps. And for the most part, they do. HVP, who knows? That's so out in the future that nobody, but what happens when polio comes back, which is right there in your face, a deadly situation? And what happens when smallpox comes back? And that's another right in your face, deadly. Now, what do the states, what does the federal government do when you really have an all-out deadly outbreaks of these kinds of diseases?
Yeah, two comments. One, again, I didn't want to say too much about Kennedy, but clearly Kennedy is contributing to what you just described. People not taking these things seriously, right? He talks about, he keeps saying, when I was a kid, and he doesn't even have that correct. He's not even, oh no, I know he is, but I'm just saying, back when I was a kid, kids would get measles and so on. He's not even being accurate in terms of when he was a kid and what was going on. Oh, no, I know that. No, it's hypocritical, unquestionably hypocritical. But what I'm getting at is he's in the news every day saying that, first of all, there are ways of dealing with this, nutrition, vitamin A, et cetera, and he also is constantly downplaying the seriousness of what you just described. And that's the message that's going out to the public, and why they're not feeling. I think that's contributing directly to that survey that shows that 33% it's actually pregnant women, I think that was the survey, are not planning to vaccinate their children, because the message that Kennedy's sending out is these are not serious. I'm trying to remember the second part of what I wanted to respond to. Oh no, well, it's going to be a calamity. I can't even begin to imagine what that's going to be like, because
No, I'm just asking.
no, I can't imagine what it's going to be like. And in some ways, and this is what people are saying, it's going to be too late, because we're just going to go through it again. When COVID first started, I read a book by John Berryman. I think that's his last name, teaches at the University of Minnesota. He wrote a book called The Great Affluenza. Oh, that's something else Kennedy says. He says that people actually didn't die of the epidemic in 1918. They died of other things. Yes, there were other things that came as a result of their viral infection. So anyway, I'm sorry, I don't mean to.
So let's take another question.
No,
Take another
the
question.
only thing I wanted to say, I just want to finish one point, and that is that I recommend that book very highly. It's an amazing analysis of what we learned in 1918. Incredible lessons, none of which we followed in the recent yeah.
I was just gonna say.
Yeah, they don't remember.
I was just going to say that, don't you think it's also memory? The younger generations have no visceral memory of polio,
Yeah.
So
Yeah, no,
it's a very hard thing to
you're absolutely right.
illustrate
And who actually is the person who really is pushing back against Kennedy is McDonald, because he remembers he had polio as a kid. Yeah, and some of us do remember, and how terrifying that was. It is the success. It's the success of the vaccines that has caused people not to have any kind of memory. The same with fluoridation, which is also going to have very bad results when states stop fluoridating water.
We're about out of time, and I wanted to make sure we heard questions and comments from the webinar audience. There's a comment and a question from Kathy. We seem to be stuck on cost-benefit analysis of the vaccination problem. Why don't we look at it in terms of justice or equity or equality? Is there another approach?
Well, I no, I think that's a good question. Well, I tried to very quickly sketch one possible, and I said I wanted to think about it some more, one possible way of arguing for vaccination for all kids. And that, yeah, I think that that's a way to argue. On the other hand, I think things are so, it's like so multifaceted, so many different issues, so many different arguments that different people make. And it's post-COVID and all the resistance that went on during that time. I'm not sure that I don't have the faith that we're going to get beyond either cost benefit or compromise or continuing efforts at education. I just don't think we're going to get there. I'm not particularly optimistic about it, unless, I mean, I think there are justice arguments that we make, but those have to be enforced by law enforcement. One of the things that I remember reading in the book that I just mentioned is that in San Francisco, there's an extremely serious lockdown that the police were actively enforcing, to the point where they saw people walking around without a mask and shot over their head, telling them, put on your masks. Are we ever going to get to that kind of law enforcement? No. But no, there was serious efforts back then. See, that's one lesson that was learned back in 1918, and we didn't, the law enforcement, depending on the state you're in, were more or less interested in enforcing the laws. So, yeah. Well, that, I'm retired from teaching big undergraduate classes, but I would have a class of 300. And I would say, how many of you know what an iron lung is? We're talking about a class of 300. 3 hands would go up. And then I'd show them a picture of an iron lung with a kid in the iron lung. And they say, oh my God. Yeah.
Folks, we're out of time. And first of all, I'd like to extend great thanks to Mark Sheldon at Northwestern University.
Thank you.
And I can hear people clapping online too. So
Thank you very much to all of you for really good questions and for being here.